Hey, Shahid, and thank you for having me. I think when we talk about privacy and specifically us activists and advocates, we focus a lot on how we're being surveilled and what data is being collected about us. And then, as active people as we are, we like to jump right into solutions as to how do we fix the problems with how we're being surveilled. And today I want to focus on a question that we often skip in that process, which is why does privacy matter? And when we talk about why does privacy matter, what we're really asking is why should we care about privacy even if we have nothing to hide? And privacy is kind of this abstract concept. It can be difficult to know when our privacy is being lost. And when we lose our privacy, we don't always see the consequences of that right away. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes our privacy abuses affect us in ways that we don't even realize or realize for years until after they happen. And it's sort of this intangible concept that can be very hard to place how it's impacting our lives. And I think the most clear example of a way in which privacy impacts society is looking at a country without privacy, and that's China. China, in many ways, is the world leader in government surveillance. They have hundreds of millions of cameras in urban areas and rural areas alike that are equipped with facial recognition technology and are really conducting mass surveillance on all of their citizens, both in terms of the behavior that they do online, but also offline in the physical world as well. Chinese companies are required by Chinese law to share data with the Chinese government if they're compelled to do so. So there's no they don't have the same constitutional protections that we have in the U.S., where they have the right against unreasonable searches and seizures. If the government asks for data, the companies are required to share that data with the government. They also build backdoors into their products so that the government can access that data whenever it wants to. And China is using this data in really problematic ways. So China and the Chinese Communist Party obviously has a long history of oppressive action against its people, but they're also compiling all this data and in the process of rolling out what they call a social credit system. And the idea is that they would combine all of this data that they're collecting based on people's in-person behavior and also their digital activity, and use it to create what they call a social credit score to basically decide what government services people might have access to in China. So that could be everything from whether or not you have the ability to get a travel visa, whether or not you can access public transport or receive government benefits, whether you can get a government mortgage to buy a home. And it's still unclear, how exactly this data will be used or what the criteria are. But it begs the obvious question, which is what defines good behavior and what defines bad behavior? And the answer to that question is whoever has the power and whoever has access to the data. So in the case of the Chinese government, things that might qualify as bad behavior are things like theft and other criminal behavior, but it could also be things like buying non-Chinese products. China just passed a law limiting when people can play video games. So playing video games during unauthorized times, making unauthorized political speech, speaking out against the government. And again, while this is in its very early stages and we don't know exactly how it's going to be implemented, people could be punished not only for their own unauthorized political speech, but also for the people with whom they associate. So merely by communicating with people who have spoken out against the government, whether online or offline, people could be punished or denied services for doing that. And the result of that is that people who are dissidents become social pariahs and become ostracized from society, because others, even if they don't have a problem with those speaking out against the government, they fear associating with them because that might result in government reprisal against them just for associating with the wrong people. So many of you would rightly say that, well, the problem with China and the Chinese Communist Party isn't really about privacy. It's about the authoritarian regime in China and the oppressive human rights actions that they take. And I think, that underestimates the fact that even in the US, even if you've done nothing wrong, that doesn't mean that no one wishes you harm. So that's whether you have a stalker, a sexual predator or domestic abuser, or any rivals or enemies, someone can wish you harm and use your private information to enact harm on you, even if you've done nothing wrong. And even in the US, our government uses data in ways that can be certainly problematic. So, the government collects all kinds of bulk warrantless surveillance, and they use that data for all kinds of things. That can be to conduct ICE deportations against people who haven't committed other crimes. And even if the government has the best of intentions, it leaves them vulnerable to negligence. So when our data is collected in bulk and lots of personal data is collected about us, even if the person or entity collecting it doesn't wish to use that in a way that would be harmful to us, is a very likely possibility in today's world that data could be accessed by someone who isn't supposed to have access to it and could get in the wrong hands and used for all kinds of nefarious behavior. Now, a lot of us take comfort in the fact that, even if when we say we have nothing to hide, what we really mean is that, well, we don't want people rummaging through all the details of our personal life, but that most of our data is not read by people, that we're unimportant, and that while lots of sensitive data is collected about us, it's lost in a sea of unusable information. And while there's certainly some very notable and important exceptions to that, that is true for a lot of people. But it neglects an important reality, which is that most of our data is not read by people, it's read by machines and algorithms. And we think about privacy in the context of what are the things we have to hide, what are the secrets we have. But our privacy lies not only in our secrets, but in the collective story our data tells. And that story reveals deep patterns about who we are, what we believe, and perhaps most importantly, how we can be manipulated. And giving up so much of our private information leaves us vulnerable to manipulation. So instead of asking, what do we have to hide? What we should really be asking is, who has the ability to change our behavior or our beliefs? And what are their incentives? What did they want to happen? So in the case of many commercial entities which have advertising-driven business models, they have two pretty simple incentives. One is to get us to spend more time on their products so that they can sell more ads. And two is to sell more effective advertising so that they can sell those ads for more money to advertisers. And that's fundamentally misaligned with our incentives for how we use products. If, for instance, with Facebook or YouTube or whatever social media, the optimal product for us as consumers is not one which optimizes the amount of time we spend on those products. That, spending 10 hours a day on social media is probably a lot worse for us than spending 1 hour a day on social media. And, this affects us in all kinds of ways, but it can be especially troubling when we think about elections. So our private information reveals things like what type of political propaganda might work on us. And it also is exploited through this practice called micro-targeting, which is the idea that instead of giving one ad or one speech, which goes to all people, that we're increasingly targeted as individuals. So we see something that no one else sees. We get a version of the ad that only a few other people see, and that is unique to us. So in the context of a political campaign, we talk about politicians being two-faced, but in reality, in today's political advertising, they can not only be two-faced, they can be a million-faced. They can have different versions of who they are and what they believe, which they present to each of us based on what they know about us. And those messages can be contradictory. They can, tell one group they're pro-choice, one group they're pro-life, one group they're pro-gun, one group they're anti-gun. It's all of these things that enable them to message based on who we are rather than who they are. And as technologies like deep fakes become more and more effective, it becomes easier and easier to alter our thinking, and it becomes harder for us as individuals to distinguish what is true from what is false. And these platforms, as a general rule, based on their incentives, prioritize engagement over things like nuance and truth. And we also have problems as it relates to the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, for those of you who don't know, of the US Constitution protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and establishes the standard of warrants and probable cause. And this is a really important protection for our civil liberties. But there's a lot of unanswered questions about what the Fourth Amendment means in the context of digital. So for instance, what constitutes probable cause? If you are a 70% match on a facial recognition camera, is that probable cause? Well, most of you would say probably not, but what about 90%? What about 95%? What about 99%? What if your phone was at a location which was near a crime scene? So all of these things are difficult questions that we need to draw the line somewhere, and it's unclear where that line is going to be drawn. We also have the issue of what constitutes search and seizure. So, we think of search and seizure as people can't, search our homes or our property, but what is it counts as search and seizure if we don't even realize that we're being searched? What if the government can acquire that data without our knowledge, or acquire it for free, or by buying it from a private company? What if they're searching it by an algorithm and not by a human? Do these things qualify as search and seizure? And I, as a privacy advocate and a defender of the Fourth Amendment, would say yes, but I think there's a lot of unanswered questions as to what the future of the Fourth Amendment looks like in the context of digital. So one perspective is the former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, back in 2009, said if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. And in Schmidt's defense, he pretty quickly backtracked on these comments in the face of criticism. But this brings us back to our original question, which is who defines what is good and versus bad behavior? And the idea that we're always being surveilled has a really troubling effect on society. So there's an old adage, or I guess I should say a not so old adage, to send every email as though it will be read aloud in a court of law. And I think that's, in a lot of senses, good legal advice, because you want to be careful what you put in writing, and it can come back in a legal setting. But as everything we do, everything we say becomes increasingly surveilled, that adage becomes not send every email as though it will be read aloud in a court of law, but everything you do or say should be done as though it will be evidence in a court of law. And that has a really chilling effect on our behavior and on society. The mere fear of being watched and that we could face consequences for everything we do or say in any setting, offline or online, pushes us towards conformity and towards obedience. And I'm someone who believes a lot in individuality and dissent. And a world without privacy would threaten those rights. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to the panel in a couple minutes.